The October rain drummed against the tall windows of Bellingham House with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, and Lady Catherine Bellingham found herself wishing she had chosen a more auspicious evening for her charitable soirée. The Georgian mansion, nestled in the heart of Bloomsbury, had witnessed many distinguished gatherings over its 2 centuries of existence, but tonight's assembly promised to be particularly memorable, though not, as it would transpire, for the reasons she had intended. The occasion was both scholarly and philanthropic. The unveiling of the legendary keys of Saint Augustine, 3 exquisite medieval artifacts recently acquired through the combined efforts of the Bellingham Foundation and the British Museum. These were not ordinary keys, but ceremonial objects of extraordinary beauty and historical significance. The key of faith, wrought in gold with intricate Celtic knotwork. The key of hope, fashioned from silver and adorned with precious stones, and the key of charity, cast in bronze and inscribed with Latin verses from Augustine's own writings. Legend held that these keys had once belonged to the great Bishop of Hippo himself, though more credible scholarship suggested they were the work of 9th-century Irish monks who had venerated his memory. Dr. Reginald Whitmore, the distinguished medievalist who had authenticated the artifacts, stood near the display case with the proprietary air of a man whose reputation rested upon the objects before him. A tall, spare figure with prematurely white hair and the intense gaze of the true scholar, he had spent the better part of 3 years tracing the keys through various private collections across Europe. His success in acquiring them for British scholarship had earned him considerable acclaim, though it had also, as such successes often do, attracted a certain amount of professional jealousy. The drawing room was elegantly appointed for the evening's presentation, with perhaps 30 guests assembled, a carefully curated selection of academics, collectors, and benefactors. Lady Catherine herself, a woman of 60 with the bearing of one accustomed to both wealth and responsibility, moved among her guests with practiced grace. Her nephew, James Bellingham, a restless young man whose interests ran more to motor cars than manuscripts, hovered near the refreshment table with the air of one fulfilling an obligation. Professor Marcus Thornfield, Whitmore's former colleague from Cambridge, examined the display case with the careful attention of an expert. There had been, those who knew such things whispered, a certain professional disagreement between the 2 men regarding the key's provenance. Nothing so dramatic as a public quarrel, but the sort of scholarly dispute that could simmer for years beneath the surface of academic courtesy. Miss Evelyn Hartwell, Dr. Whitmore's research assistant, stood quietly to one side, her notebook in hand, and her dark eyes alert, behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She was a woman of perhaps 30, with the composed manner of one who had learned to make herself indispensable through competence rather than charm. Her devotion to Dr. Whitmore's work was well known, though whether it extended beyond the purely professional was a matter of some speculation among their colleagues. Near the fireplace, Mr. Oliver Pemberton, the art dealer who had facilitated the key's acquisition, engaged in animated conversation with Lady Catherine. A man of impeccable taste and questionable ethics, Pemberton had built his reputation on his ability to locate objects that others had given up for lost. His commission on the transaction had been substantial, though not apparently substantial enough to satisfy certain pressing debts. Father Benedict Morrison, the elderly priest who served as the Foundation's theological advisor, stood somewhat apart from the others, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the keys with the intensity of one who saw in them something beyond mere historical curiosity. He had known Augustine's writings intimately for more than 40 years, and the key's symbolism resonated with him in ways that transcended academic interest. At precisely 8 o'clock, Lady Catherine called for attention. The assembled guests arranged themselves in a semicircle around the display case, their faces reflecting the warm glow of the carefully positioned lighting. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his usual scholarly diffidence replaced by the confidence of a man in his element. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed room. it is my profound honor to present to you artifacts that connect us directly to one of the greatest minds in Christian history. These keys, whether they belong to Augustine himself or were created in his memory, represent the three theological virtues that formed the cornerstone of his teaching. He gestured toward each key in turn, explaining their symbolism and construction with the passion of the true enthusiast. The audience listened with the respectful attention due to both the speaker and the occasion, though more than one pair of eyes strayed to assess the reactions of their neighbors. It was Miss Hartwell who first noticed that something was amiss. As Dr. Whitmore concluded his presentation and moved to unlock the display case for a closer viewing, she observed that the small crowd had somehow shifted, creating an unusual configuration around the case. Professor Thornfield had positioned himself directly behind Dr. Whitmore, while Mr. Pemberton had moved to the left side of the case, his hand resting casually on its edge. Father Morrison remained where he had been, but his attention seemed focused not on the keys, but on the faces around him. Dr. Whitmore inserted his key into the first of the case's 3 locks, a security measure insisted upon by the insurance company. Lady Catherine provided the second key, and Miss Hartwell, as the appointed keeper of the third, stepped forward to complete the unlocking sequence. The mechanism turned smoothly, and the glass lid rose with a soft whisper. It was at that precise moment that the lights failed. The darkness was not complete. The fire in the grate still cast its dancing shadows, and the street lamps beyond the windows provided a dim glow, but it was sudden enough to cause a collective intake of breath from the assembled guests. Someone laughed nervously. A woman's voice called out, "How perfectly theatrical!" There was the sound of movement, a soft exclamation, and then the distinct clink of metal against glass. The lights returned as suddenly as they had departed, revealing a scene of elegant confusion. The guests had instinctively moved closer together, creating a tight knot around the display case. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen at the case's edge, his face pale in the restored illumination. The glass lid remained open, but something was terribly wrong. Miss Hartwell was the first to speak, her voice cutting through the murmur of confused conversation. The key of charity is missing. Indeed, where the bronze key had lain moments before, there was now only empty velvet. The other 2 keys remained in their positions, but the third had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. "Impossible," breathed Professor Thornfield, leaning forward to peer into the case. The case was never left unattended. "The lights were out for perhaps 10 seconds, Lady Catherine said, her voice carefully controlled. "Surely not long enough for—" She was interrupted by a sound that chilled every heart in the room. A low, agonized groan from the direction of the library. All eyes turned toward the partially open door that led to the adjacent room, where Dr. Whitmore kept his research materials. James Bellingham, with the quick reflexes of youth, reached the library first. His sharp cry brought the others rushing after him. There, sprawled beside the great oak desk, lay Dr. Whitmore, but not the Dr. Whitmore who had been addressing them moments before. This figure wore the scholar's clothes and bore his features, but the face was gray with shock and pain, and a thin line of blood traced from beneath his collar. "Good God!" whispered Father Morrison, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man. "He's been stabbed!" The room erupted in confusion. Voices raised in alarm, someone calling for a doctor, the sound of rapid footsteps. But through it all, one fact remained starkly clear. If Dr. Whitmore lay dying in the library, then who had been standing at the display case when the lights went out? Lady Catherine, her face set in lines of grim determination, moved to the library door and turned the key in the lock. "No one leaves," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "I'm telephoning for the police immediately, and until they arrive, we shall all remain exactly where we are." If summoned by her words, the butler appeared in the doorway, his usual composure intact despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Madame," he said quietly, "I took the liberty of telephoning Scotland Yard the moment the lights failed, Inspector Bradshaw is en route, and he mentioned that he would be bringing with him a certain foreign gentleman who has assisted the Yard in similar matters." Miss Hartwell looked up from where she knelt beside the wounded man, her face pale but determined. "A foreign gentleman?" The butler's expression remained impassive. "A Belgian detective, miss. Monsieur Hercule Poirot." The name fell into the shocked silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples of recognition and apprehension. The keys of Saint Augustine had claimed their first victim, but the mystery they had unlocked was only beginning to reveal its true complexity. Outside, the rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, as if the very heavens were keeping time with the approaching footsteps of justice. The quarter hour that followed Dr. Whitmore's discovery passed with the peculiar mixture of chaos and enforced stillness that accompanies such extraordinary circumstances. Father Morrison, his hands steady despite his advanced years, had managed to staunch the bleeding from what appeared to be a shallow but precise wound to the scholar's shoulder. Dr. Whitmore drifted in and out of consciousness, his lips moving occasionally in what might have been attempts at speech, though no coherent words emerged save for that haunting fragment. "Not he." Miss Hartwell had taken charge of the immediate arrangements with the efficiency that marked all her endeavors, dispatching James Bellingham to fetch blankets and instructing the butler to summon a physician. Her composure was remarkable under the circumstances, though those who observed her closely noted the slight tremor in her hands as she knelt beside her employer, her notebook forgotten on the Persian carpet. Professor Thornfield paced the length of the drawing-room with barely contained agitation, his scholarly detachment having given way to something approaching panic. "This is preposterous," he muttered, his voice carrying the edge of a man whose carefully constructed world had suddenly tilted off its axis. Who could have predicted the precise moment when the case would be opened? Who could have known about the security arrangements? "Someone who was present when those arrangements were made," Lady Catherine replied with characteristic directness. She stood near the window, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass, but her attention focused entirely on the room behind her. "The question is not who could have known, Marcus, but who among us chose to act upon that knowledge." Mr. Pemberton had positioned himself near the fireplace, his usual urbane confidence notably absent. The art dealer's practiced eye kept returning to the display case, where the two remaining keys caught the firelight with an almost mocking brilliance. "The key of charity," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "Of all the keys to steal, why that one? The gold is worth considerably more. The silver bears precious stones." It was Father Morrison who provided the observation that would later prove significant. "Perhaps," he said quietly, not looking up from his vigil beside the wounded man. The thief was not motivated by monetary considerations. The key of charity bears Augustine's own words about ordered love, caritas ordinata. For someone who truly understood the saint's teachings, that inscription might hold value beyond gold or silver. The sound of arriving vehicles in the street below interrupted further speculation. Lady Catherine moved to the window and peered through the rain. "The police," she announced, and there was unmistakable relief in her voice, and another car behind them. Within minutes, uniformed constables had secured the scene with professional efficiency. They were followed by Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, a solid, methodical man whose reputation for thoroughness was matched only by his distrust of overly theatrical solutions to criminal puzzles. He moved immediately to examine the wounded man, then emerged from the library with his characteristic expression of grim determination. "Right then," Japp announced, his voice cutting through the subdued murmurs. "Dr. Whitmore's condition is serious but stable. The wound appears deliberate but not immediately fatal. Whether by design or fortune, we'll determine later. The missing key confirms we're dealing with both theft and attempted murder." He paused, scanning the assembled faces. "No one leaves this house until we've had proper interviews with everyone present." It was then that a small, impeccably dressed figure stepped forward from behind the inspector. Hercule Poirot, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly in characteristic fashion, surveyed the room with pale green eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail with the precision of a master craftsman examining his materials. His waxed mustache was perfectly symmetrical, his evening clothes immaculate despite the late hour and inclement weather. "Mes amis," Poirot said, his accent lending curious formality to the English words, "I perceive that we have here a most interesting problem. A theft, certainly, but also an attempt at murder, and the two events, they are connected, of course, but not perhaps in the manner that first suggests itself to the casual observer." He did not immediately rush to examine the display case or the library. Instead, he remained in the center of the drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted as if listening to some sound audible only to himself. His quiet presence seemed to exert a subtle pressure on everyone in the room, transforming the elegant gathering into something resembling a tableau of guilt and apprehension. The lights. He observed suddenly, addressing no one in particular. They failed at the precise moment when the case was opened. This was not, I think, a coincidence of the electrical supply. Someone knew exactly when to act, exactly how long they would have, exactly what they wished to accomplish. He turned to Lady Catherine with a small, courteous bow. "Madame, if you would be so kind as to tell Poirot exactly what occurred, from the beginning, and with all the small details that others might consider unimportant. It is often in such details that the truth chooses to hide itself." The hunt for psychological inconsistencies had begun. Lady Catherine's account proved as methodical as Poirot could have wished. She detailed the evening's preparations with the precision of one accustomed to managing complex charitable endeavors, explaining how the 3-key security system had been implemented at the insurance company's insistence. Each key holder had been selected for both trustworthiness and symbolic significance, herself as the Foundation's patron, Dr. Whitmore as the scholarly authority, and Miss Hartwell as the keeper of the research. The timing of the presentation was Dr. Whitmore's suggestion, Lady Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. 8 o'clock precisely, to allow all guests to arrive and settle. Though Professor Thornfield was nearly late, some difficulty with his motor car, he said. Poirot's pale eyes shifted to the Cambridge scholar, who stood with barely concealed agitation near the fireplace. "Indeed, Professor, you arrived at what time exactly?" "Perhaps 10 minutes before the presentation began," Thornfield replied, his scholarly composure fraying at the edges. "The radiator overheated just as I reached Bloomsbury. Most inconvenient timing. But not so inconvenient as to prevent you from positioning yourself directly behind Dr. Whitmore when the case was opened," Poirot observed mildly. Miss Hartwell, who had been listening with characteristic attention to detail, spoke quietly. "Professor Thornfield has questioned the authenticity of the keys since Dr. Whitmore first acquired them. He published a paper suggesting they might be clever forgeries." The admission fell into the room like a stone into still water. Thornfield's face flushed, but before he could respond, Poirot raised a small, perfectly manicured hand. "Ah, but this is most illuminating. A scholarly dispute that might have professional consequences, no? If the keys were proven false, Dr. Whitmore's reputation would suffer considerably." "My concerns were legitimate," Thornfield insisted. "The provenance was questionable, the documentation incomplete. I merely suggested further authentication was warranted." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then addressed the room at large. "We shall reconstruct the moment, if you please. Each person will return to their exact position when the case was opened. The body remembers what the mind may forget." They arranged themselves with the peculiar solemnity of actors taking their marks. Miss Hartwell moved to the right of the case, her leather purse still clutched unconsciously in her hand. Professor Thornfield positioned himself behind where Dr. Whitmore had stood, his frame tense with suppressed energy. Mr. Pemberton took his place to the left, fingers hovering near the glass. Father Morrison remained by the hearth, hands folded, while James Bellingham drifted toward the refreshment table. Lady Catherine stood slightly off-center, facing the display. "Now," Poirot said, moving to the light switch, We shall have our 10 seconds of darkness." The room plunged into the uncertain world of firelight and street lamp shadows. In the darkness, Poirot's voice came calm and measured. "Notice how faces disappear, how only height and outline remain. A familiar gesture, a recognizable posture. These things can deceive when the eyes cannot confirm." When the lights returned, he studied each face with the intensity of a portraitist. "You perceive? In such darkness, one might easily mistake identity if the deception were skillfully managed." It was then that the butler approached with quiet deference. "Madame," he said to Lady Catherine, "I should mention the note that arrived this morning. Anonymous. It read, 'The third is not yours to display.'" Japp straightened. "You didn't think to mention this earlier?" "I advised Lady Catherine to inform the police immediately," the butler replied. "It was why I telephoned Scotland Yard the moment the lights failed." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Most prescient. Someone knew exactly what would be attempted tonight. He moved closer to the display case, studying not the remaining keys, but the empty space where the key of charity had rested. "Tell me, what made this particular key unique? Beyond its bronze composition?" Miss Hartwell consulted her notebook. The inscription was different from the others. While the gold and silver keys bore standard Latin prayers, the key of charity contained what appeared to be a personal message. Dr. Whitmore believed it might have been dictated by Augustine himself. "And this inscription said what, precisely?" "Ubi thesaurus tuus, ibi cor tuum," she replied. "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." But there was a second line Dr. Whitmore was still translating, something about hidden wisdom and the key to understanding. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. "Most interesting. And this translation, Dr. Whitmore shared it with others?" "He was quite secretive about the final interpretation," Miss Hartwell admitted. "It was to be part of tonight's presentation." "Ah," Poirot murmured, stroking his mustache. "Then perhaps our thief sought not merely an artifact, but knowledge itself, the key to something far more valuable than bronze or gold." He turned to face the assembled suspects, his pale eyes seeming to catalogue every nervous gesture, every avoided glance. "We shall speak with each of you individually, mes amis, beginning with Mademoiselle Hartwell, who sees much and whose devotion reveals truths that resentment might conceal." The psychological game had begun in earnest. The morning room, with its delicate Wedgwood blue walls and collection of botanical prints, provided a more intimate setting for Poirot's methodical inquiry. Miss Hartwell settled herself in the chair he indicated with the composed manner of one accustomed to academic discussions, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremor as they adjusted the clasp of her leather purse. The sound of Dr. Whitmore's labored breathing from the adjacent library served as a constant reminder of the evening's violence. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began, his voice gentle yet penetrating, "you have worked closely with Dr. Whitmore for how long?" "Nearly 5 years," she replied, consulting her notebook, though Poirot suspected she required no such reference. "Since completing my doctorate at Cambridge, Dr. Whitmore offered me the position when my dissertation on medieval manuscript illumination caught his attention at a conference." Poirot's pale eyes remained fixed on her face with the intensity of a portraitist studying his subject. "And your relationship with the good doctor, it extends beyond the purely professional." A faint color rose in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Dr. Whitmore is a brilliant scholar and a considerate employer." "Nothing more?" Yet something in her tone suggested depths unexplored, loyalties that transcended mere professional obligation. "You carry yourself with the devotion of one whose heart is perhaps more engaged than the mind admits," Poirot observed with characteristic directness. "But we shall speak of the evening's events. What did you observe during those crucial moments before the lights failed?" Miss Hartwell's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. Professor Thornfield positioned himself quite deliberately behind Dr. Whitmore, close enough that in the darkness, their heights being similar, One might easily mistake one for the other. Mr. Pemberton seemed unusually nervous, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. There was also... She hesitated. A distinct scent in the air, not the usual mixture of cologne and pipe tobacco one expects at such gatherings. Something warmer, more exotic. Sandalwood, perhaps, Poirot suggested mildly. Yes, that's precisely it. Quite distinctive. Inspector Japp made a careful note as Poirot continued his gentle probing. The key of charity, Dr. Whitmore believed it held particular significance beyond its obvious symbolic value. Miss Hartwell's grip tightened on her notebook. He was convinced the inscription contained a coded reference to Augustine's lost writings. Specifically, he believed it might lead to the discovery of a 13th book of the Confessions, a work that scholars have theorized about for centuries but never proven to exist. And such a discovery would be worth millions to the right collector. But more than that, it would cement Dr. Whitmore's reputation as the preeminent Augustan scholar of his generation. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He received several disturbing telephone calls yesterday. One caller spoke in Latin, discussing something about the corruption of love and treasures that destroy their keepers. Dr. Whitmore was quite shaken afterward. Poirot leaned forward slightly. This morning, when he entrusted you with the third key, did he express any particular concerns? He said something that troubled me greatly. Miss Hartwell's composure finally cracked, revealing the depth of her emotional investment. He said, "If anything should happen to me tonight, Evelyn, remember that Augustine wrote about the corruption of love. Sometimes what we treasure most becomes the instrument of our destruction." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Japp before continuing. "During the presentation itself, you observed the other guests carefully?" James Bellingham kept glancing toward the library door as if expecting someone. Professor Thornfield watched Dr. Whitmore rather than the keys themselves. And when the lights failed, she paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her purse. "Someone brushed against me in the darkness. A tall person from the angle of contact. I heard the distinct sound of metal against glass. Then footsteps moving toward the library. You are most observant, mademoiselle. One final question." Poirot's eyes dropped to the substantial leather purse she clutched. "You carry that with you always?" "Of course. It contains my research materials. Notebooks." Her voice trailed off as she realized the implication of his scrutiny. As Miss Hartwell was escorted back to the drawing room, Poirot remained seated, his pale eyes fixed on some invisible point. The psychological portrait was beginning to emerge, painted in shades of scholarly ambition, unrequited devotion, and the dangerous allure of lost knowledge. "Bring me Monsieur Pemberton," he instructed Japp quietly. "A man who wears sandalwood and checks his watch bears watching indeed." Mr. Oliver Pemberton entered the morning room with the practiced composure of a man accustomed to delicate negotiations, though the subtle tremor in his manicured hands and the tightness around his pale blue eyes betrayed the strain beneath his polished exterior. The distinctive scent of sandalwood that Miss Hartwell had noted accompanied him like an expensive calling card, more pronounced now in the intimate confines of the smaller room. "Monsieur Pemberton," Poirot began with characteristic courtesy, gesturing toward the chair recently vacated by Miss Hartwell. "You have had considerable involvement in acquiring these remarkable keys, n'est-ce pas?" Pemberton settled himself with calculated ease, adjusting his perfectly tailored evening jacket. "Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, the negotiation required nearly 18 months of the most delicate diplomacy. The previous owner, a private collector in Vienna, was extraordinarily particular about discretion." He paused, meeting Poirot's penetrating gaze directly. "My business depends entirely upon confidentiality. Clients expect absolute discretion in all transactions." "Naturally. Yet tonight's events suggest that such discretion may have been compromised." Poirot's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "Your commission on this transaction, it was substantial?" A flicker of calculation crossed Pemberton's features. 20% of the purchase price, standard for acquisitions of this complexity, which amounts to approximately £40,000. The figure fell into the room like a stone into still water. Inspector Japp's pencil paused in his note-taking. Such a sum represented more than most men earned in a lifetime. Poirot, however, appeared unsurprised. A considerable amount, yet I perceive from your manner that this commission has not yet been fully realized. Pemberton's urbane mask slipped almost imperceptibly. Payment schedules for such transactions are often complex. The Foundation operates on quarterly disbursements and certain administrative delays. Ah, Poirot interrupted gently. So you find yourself in the position of having advanced considerable personal funds, with payment still pending. Most inconvenient, especially if one has pressing obligations elsewhere. The art dealer's jaw tightened. My financial arrangements are hardly relevant to tonight's events. Are they not? You were observed checking your pocket watch repeatedly during the presentation. The behavior of a man under temporal pressure, perhaps? Poirot leaned forward slightly. And your positioning near the display case. Most convenient for one who knew precisely when action would be required. You're suggesting I orchestrated this entire affair? Pemberton's composure began to crack. Preposterous. I've spent months facilitating this acquisition. Unless the key of charity represented something far more valuable than bronze. Poirot's pale eyes never left Pemberton's face. You received inquiries from collectors who seemed remarkably well informed about the key's potential significance, did you not? The accusation hung heavy in the air. Pemberton's polished veneer finally shattered. I received one inquiry, he admitted reluctantly. A collector in Madrid. A gentleman with ecclesiastical tastes who had heard rumors about the inscription. He offered 3 times the key's assessed value for private access to Dr. Whitmore's translation. And your response? I refused, naturally. Even I have professional standards. Pemberton's voice carried a note of genuine indignation. But he was persistent. Several telephone calls, increasingly urgent. The final call came yesterday morning. He suggested that if the keys could not be acquired through legitimate channels, alternative arrangements might prove necessary. Inspector Japp looked up sharply. Threats? Not precisely threats. More like philosophical observations about the temporary nature of all ownership. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And during those crucial 10 seconds of darkness, Monsieur Pemberton, where exactly were your hands? The question struck like a physical blow. Pemberton paled visibly. The darkness was complete. I may have reached toward the case instinctively when I heard the sound of metal against glass. The same sound Miss Hartwell reported? Yes, precisely that sound. Poirot rose and moved closer to where Pemberton sat, his keen eyes noting every detail. You are a vain man, monsieur. You fear a scuff more than a scandal. Yet there is a dull smear upon your knee. Old wax from a floor well polished. The library floor, perhaps. Pemberton stared in surprise. I knelt when everyone surged toward the library. I stumbled and caught myself by the desk. If that constitutes a confession, Inspector, you may frame it as you wish. So you were in the library with the wounded man? With 20 others, Pemberton retorted, his earlier charm completely abandoned. If you intend to arrest me on such evidence, at least provide me the courtesy of proper charges. Poirot studied him for a long moment, then inclined his head with characteristic courtesy. Merci, Monsieur Pemberton. That will suffice for now. When the door closed behind the departing art dealer, Inspector Japp turned to Poirot with evident satisfaction. He's our man, surely. The debts, the opportunity, the scent placing him at the scene, and connections to foreign buyers. It all fits perfectly. Poirot stroked his mustache thoughtfully, his expression suggesting something approaching disappointment. He will do for a man who steals for money, mon ami. But consider, our wound upon Dr. Whitmore is precise but not fatal, whether by design or fortune remains to be seen. A man desperate for money does not risk leaving a living witness. He brings his own weapon, not a scholar's paper knife. And most importantly, he does not choose the bronze key that speaks of hidden meaning when gold and silver offer immediate profit. You're saying it's not Pemberton. I am saying the psychology protests. Monsieur Pemberton arranges sales. He does not arrange symbols. Poirot moved toward the door with characteristic precision. The obvious solution, Inspector, is often merely the most elegant deception. Our thief sought not profit, but knowledge itself. Japp followed, shaking his head. Then who does that leave us with? Professor Thornfield, with his scholarly disputes and convenient mechanical difficulties. Let us see what academic indignation might reveal when properly examined. Poirot's pale eyes gleamed with the light of the true hunter. It is often the minds that claim to seek truth that harbor the most elaborate deceptions. Professor Marcus Thornfield entered the morning room with the measured stride of a man accustomed to commanding lecture halls, though the rigid set of his shoulders betrayed the strain beneath his scholarly composure. His tall, angular frame settled into the chair with careful precision, long fingers adjusting wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the lamplight with nervous frequency. "Professor," Poirot began, with a respectful tone due to academic distinction, "your motor car difficulties this evening. Most inconvenient timing for such an important presentation." "Indeed," Thornfield replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of the practiced lecturer. "The radiator overheated just as I reached Russell Square. I was forced to seek assistance at a public house. The landlord obliged me with water, though the delay was most vexing." Poirot's pale eyes remained fixed on the professor's face with characteristic intensity. "You arrived at what time precisely?" "Perhaps 10 minutes before 8. Certainly no later than 7:50. Thornfield's fingers drummed against his knee in a rhythm that suggested suppressed agitation. "I'd hoped to speak privately with Whitmore before the presentation began." "Ah, you wished to discuss something specific with the good doctor?" A flicker of something, guilt, perhaps, or professional embarrassment, crossed Thornfield's features. "I had received disturbing information yesterday afternoon. A colleague at the Vatican Library contacted me with concerns about certain documentation in Whitmore's authentication papers." Inspector Japp looked up sharply from his notes. "What manner of concerns?" "The papal bull supposedly granting custody of the keys to the Irish monastery. My colleague believed it might be a sophisticated forgery. The parchment appeared genuine 13th century, but the ink composition suggested much later application." Thornfield leaned forward, his academic passion momentarily overriding his discomfort. "If proven correct, it would have invalidated Whitmore's entire chain of provenance." "And yet," Poirot observed mildly, "you positioned yourself directly behind Dr. Whitmore during the presentation. In the darkness, your similar heights might create considerable confusion about identity." "None." The accusation struck home. Thornfield's scholarly composure cracked visibly. "I was attempting to observe his reaction when the case was opened. If my suspicions were correct, he would show signs of nervousness under closer scrutiny." Poirot rose and moved to examine a small object Inspector Japp had produced from an evidence envelope. "Your signet ring, Professor. A family seal, I perceive. A griffin rampant?" "It has been mine since my father's death," Thornfield replied stiffly, unconsciously twisting the antique gold band. "Most interesting, an impression of such a ring was found on the library blotter, pressed into fresh ink." Poirot's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "You were in the library earlier this evening?" "Whitmore asked me to fetch a volume, the Pusey edition of Augustine's City of God. We had agreed to make a gesture of collegiality during the presentation, despite our professional differences." Thornfield's voice carried a note of bitter irony. "A small theater of reconciliation. Yet your paper questioning the key's authenticity was already submitted for publication." "To the Journal of Medieval Studies, yes." The admission seemed to pain him physically. "But that is precisely what I wished to discuss with Whitmore tonight." My Vatican colleague contacted me again this afternoon with additional documentation that actually supports his authentication. The keys are genuine, and my paper would have made me appear a jealous fool." The confession fell into stunned silence. Inspector Japp's pencil paused mid-sentence as the implications became clear. "So your motivation was not to discredit Dr. Whitmore, but to prevent your own professional embarrassment?" Poirot asked with evident interest. "I attempted to withdraw the paper this morning, but the journal had already gone to press. My reputation would have been destroyed by my own hasty conclusions." Thornfield's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I came tonight hoping to arrange some form of collaborative statement that might mitigate the damage." Poirot studied the professor's haggard features with the intensity of a physician examining symptoms. "And during those crucial 10 seconds of darkness, I heard movement directly in front of me. Someone brushing past toward the library. The sound was distinctive, like expensive fabric against fabric. Then came the metallic sound Miss Hartwell mentioned, followed by rapid footsteps." "You saw nothing of this person's identity?" "The darkness was complete. Tall, certainly, from the angle of movement. Beyond that—" Thornfield shrugged helplessly. From his pocket, Japp produced a torn fragment of pasteboard. "This calling card was found beside the library desk, Professor. Yours, I believe, with writing on the reverse in Latin." Thornfield examined the fragment with scholarly attention. "The card is mine. I gave it to the butler earlier for the Foundation's secretary. But the handwriting is Whitmore's. He had a distinctive formal script for presentation notes. That phrase, cor corruptum thesaro. It's his paraphrase of Augustine's text about treasure corrupting the heart. Why tear the card? Why leave it there?" "To suggest I was in the library during the attack," Thornfield said, meeting Poirot's gaze directly. "Which I most emphatically was not." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Your academic integrity led you to correct your error, even at personal cost. Such honesty suggests a mind incapable of the deceptions required for tonight's crime." When Thornfield had been escorted back to the drawing room, Inspector Japp shook his head in frustration. Another suspect eliminated. The evidence against him was almost too convenient. "Indeed, mon ami. Someone wishes us to believe in Professor Thornfield's guilt, but the psychology protests." Poirot's pale eyes gleamed with renewed interest. "Our true culprit possesses the most dangerous quality of all, the ability to appear entirely innocent while harboring the darkest intentions. Bring me Father Morrison. A man who understands Augustine's teachings about ordered love may hold keys to mysteries deeper than bronze." Father Benedict Morrison entered the morning room with the quiet dignity that marked his 70 years of devoted scholarship and pastoral service. His weathered hands, stained with decades of ink and prayer, folded naturally in his lap as he settled into the chair with the careful movements of age. The lamplight caught the silver threads in his thinning hair and emphasized the deep lines around eyes that had witnessed much of human nature's complexity. "Father," Poirot began with the particular respect he reserved for men of genuine calling, "your understanding of Saint Augustine spans many years, I perceive." "More than 40 years. Morrison replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to careful thought. "I completed my doctoral thesis on the Confessions in 1884, though I suspect my understanding of the saint's wisdom has deepened more through pastoral experience than academic study." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes reflecting genuine interest. "Then you would understand the significance of the stolen key of charity better than most. The inscription troubled Dr. Whitmore considerably, did it not?" Morrison's expression grew somber. "Indeed. When Whitmore showed me his preliminary translation yesterday afternoon, I was deeply concerned. The inscription appeared to reference Augustine's lost 13th book of the Confessions, a work that scholars have speculated about for centuries but which may never have existed. Some knowledge is dangerous precisely because it promises more than it can deliver. Yet you remained as the Foundation's theological advisor despite these concerns. I hoped to provide guidance, to encourage prudence." Morrison's hands tightened slightly in his lap. Whitmore was a brilliant scholar, but brilliance can become a form of pride. Augustine himself wrote extensively about intellectual pride as the most subtle of sins, the corruption that comes when we mistake temporal treasures for eternal ones. Inspector Japp looked up from his notes. During the presentation this evening, you positioned yourself away from the others. By the fireplace, as I often do at such gatherings, it offers a vantage point from which one can observe without being intrusive. Morrison's voice carried the weight of pastoral experience. I was watching faces, Monsieur Poirot. In my years of ministry, I've learned to read the signs of spiritual distress. Several people in that room were struggling with more than mere academic interest. What did you observe during those crucial moments before the lights failed? Morrison's reply came with careful precision. Dr. Whitmore stood at the case, speaking with his usual scholarly passion. But there was something that troubled me, a tiny detail that seemed wrong. When Latin was spoken in the room, Reginald would always trace a small cross with his right thumb upon his breast, an old habit from school, he said. Tonight, at the moment just before the lights failed, I saw the gesture, but with the left hand. The observation struck both Poirot and Japp with its significance. Such a detail spoke to fundamental questions of identity and deception. You are certain of this observation, Father? As certain as one can be of an old friend's habits, Morrison replied gravely. It troubled me, though I could not have said why until later. And during the darkness itself, I heard the distinctive sound of metal against glass, as others have reported. But I also heard something else, a whispered prayer in Latin, the Veni Creator Spiritus. It struck me as profoundly odd, given the circumstances. Morrison's voice grew heavy with implication. A prayer for divine guidance, or perhaps for forgiveness. Poirot's pale eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. The human heart is capable of extraordinary self-deception, is it not, Father? Indeed, a person might convince themselves that even theft and violence serve a higher purpose if the cause seems sufficiently noble. Morrison met Poirot's penetrating gaze directly. The preservation of Augustine's true legacy from those who would exploit it for personal gain. Such a motive might justify almost anything to a corrupted conscience. A discreet knock interrupted them. The physician, a harried man with spectacles misted from the rain, stood at the threshold. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector, Dr. Whitmore stirred a moment ago. He spoke a phrase and fell back unconscious. I thought it best to relay it immediately. Japp was already at the door. What did he say? He said quite distinctly, non il, non ille. And then something about charity concealed. Not he, Morrison translated quietly. Not he. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Poirot remained motionless for a long moment, his reflection multiplied in the rain-streaked window like fragments of a shattered mirror. There is one more matter, Father, he said finally. Young James Bellingham mentioned to you a second anonymous note? Morrison nodded gravely. Yesterday evening. More threatening than the first, containing specific details about the security arrangements that should have been known only to the key holders. James was genuinely concerned for his aunt's safety, though Lady Catherine chose not to inform the police. The psychology becomes clearer, Inspector, Poirot murmured as Father Morrison was escorted back to the drawing-room. Our criminal possesses the most dangerous quality of all, the absolute conviction of righteousness, combined with intimate knowledge of the evening's arrangements. We are dealing with someone who believes themselves to be serving the highest good while committing the gravest sins. He turned from the window, his pale eyes gleaming with the light of the true hunter. Bring me young Monsieur Bellingham, a restless soul who questions the relationship between good intentions and bad methods may hold the final keys to this mystery. James Bellingham entered the morning room with the restless energy of youth constrained by circumstance, his evening clothes bearing the subtle disarray of a man more comfortable with mechanical precision than social formality. His sandy hair was disheveled from repeatedly running his hands through it, and his intelligent eyes carried the particular alertness of someone who preferred action to contemplation but found himself trapped in a world of words and theories. Monsieur Bellingham, Poirot began with characteristic courtesy, settling back in his chair with the patient demeanor of a confessor. "You have shown admirable presence of mind tonight. Such quick thinking in discovering Dr. Whitmore speaks well of your character." James shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasping and unclasping with nervous energy. "Anyone would have done the same, Monsieur Poirot. When I heard that groan from the library, instinct took over, though I must confess the sight of blood nearly overwhelmed me entirely. Yet you maintained sufficient composure to organize the immediate response and observe crucial details." Poirot's pale eyes studied the young man with evident interest. "You mentioned to Father Morrison that a second anonymous note arrived yesterday evening. Why did you choose not to inform Lady Catherine immediately?" James's casual demeanor flickered, revealing the protective concern beneath his apparent indifference. "I found it slipped under the main door sometime after dinner, addressed simply to the nephew. Aunt Catherine was already anxious about the first warning, and I thought, perhaps foolishly, that I could handle whatever threat it represented without alarming her further." "Most considerate. What precisely did this second communication contain?" "Details that chilled my blood," James admitted quietly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It described the 3-key security system perfectly, mentioned the exact timing of the presentation, even referenced the specific positions where each key holder would stand. The writer knew everything about tonight's arrangements, down to the insurance requirements and the lighting setup." Inspector Japp looked up sharply from his notes. "You still possess this note?" "I brought it with me tonight, thinking to show it to Father Morrison after the presentation." James reached into his inner jacket pocket, producing a folded paper with edges creased from repeated handling. "The content was so unlike anything rational that I convinced myself it must be the work of some religious fanatic with too much time and too detailed knowledge of our affairs." Poirot accepted the note, his keen eyes scanning the precisely formed handwriting. The message was stark in its implications. "The treasure of Augustine shall not be profaned by those who mistake earthly glory for divine wisdom. The key of charity must return to its rightful keeper. Tonight, disorder shall breed its own correction. Be warned, the hand that grasps what belongs to eternity shall find only blood and sorrow." The handwriting appears educated, formal, the script of someone accustomed to scholarly correspondence, Poirot observed, passing the note to Inspector Japp. "During those crucial 10 seconds of darkness, you were positioned near the refreshment table. What precisely did you observe?" James's response came with the careful precision of someone who had replayed the moments repeatedly in his mind. "I heard movement toward the library. Someone tall from the sound of their stride. But there was something else that struck me as significant. I heard a distinct sound from the hall, a soft thud, like something being dropped into the wooden contribution box we had placed beside the library door." "The contribution box?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with sudden interest. "A mahogany offertory box for the Foundation's donations, hinged lid with a brass hasp and a slot across the top. I had noticed earlier that the lid wasn't sitting quite flush after the lights returned, though in all the confusion I didn't think to investigate immediately." James leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. If someone needed to hide something quickly in the darkness, dropping it through that slot would be both simple and clever. Poirot's pale eyes gleamed with the light of understanding. "Most illuminating. And Dr. Whitmore, during the presentation, did anything about his manner seem unusual?" "That's what troubled me most," James replied, his brow furrowing with concentration. "Dr. Whitmore has particular nervous habits when speaking publicly. He tugs at his collar and clears his throat repeatedly. Tonight he displayed none of these behaviors. His voice carried clearly, but he seemed almost unnaturally calm. Also, his tie was askew to the left, which was unlike his usual meticulous appearance. You are remarkably observant for one who professes disinterest in academic affairs. Mechanical precision teaches you to notice when things aren't running as they should, James replied with a slight smile. Whether it's an engine or a person, the signs of malfunction are usually visible if you know what to look for. And when you discovered Dr. Whitmore in the library? James's expression grew grave. He was sprawled beside his desk, unconscious but breathing. There was blood on his collar and a paper knife lay nearby, one of those ornate medieval replicas he collected. But what struck me most was his lips moving as if trying to speak. I leaned close and heard him whisper something that made no sense at the time. Not he, Charity concealed. Then he lapsed back into unconsciousness. Charity concealed, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Combined with your observation about the contribution box, this suggests our thief chose their hiding place with considerable symbolic appropriateness. When James had been escorted back to the drawing room, Poirot remained motionless for several minutes, his reflection multiplied in the rain-streaked windows like fragments of a complex puzzle finally beginning to align. "The pattern emerges more clearly now, Inspector," he murmured, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of dawning comprehension. "We have a criminal who possesses intimate knowledge of tonight's arrangements, access to the house, and the psychological sophistication to use religious symbolism as both motive and method. The contribution box represents more than mere convenience. It embodies the very concept of charity that our thief believes they are protecting." Inspector Japp shook his head in bewilderment. "But who among our suspects fits such a profile? Someone who has been present throughout our investigation, observing our methods and adjusting their strategy accordingly." Poirot turned from the window, his pale eyes gleaming with the intensity of the true hunter sensing the end of the chase. "It is time to examine that contribution box, mon ami. I suspect we shall find more than donations within its depths. And then we shall gather our players for the final revelation. The truth will emerge not through evidence alone, but through the psychological pressures that forces even the most careful criminal to reveal the contradictions in their carefully constructed innocence." The mahogany contribution box stood beside the library door like a silent witness to the evening's extraordinary events. Poirot approached it with the reverent care of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript, his pale eyes noting every detail of its construction and the subtle signs of recent disturbance. The brass hasp, as James had observed, bore fresh scratches where hurried fingers had worked in darkness. "Inspector," Poirot murmured, producing his silk handkerchief as he carefully lifted the lid, "observe how necessity has overcome caution. Someone opened this hastily, without regard for the delicate mechanism they knew so well. The interior revealed its secrets with dramatic precision. Nestled among the evening's modest charitable donations lay the missing key of charity, its bronze surface dulled but unmarked. But it was not alone. Wrapped carefully around the key was a sheet of expensive writing paper, creased and folded with obvious haste. As Poirot unfolded it with meticulous care, the paper revealed its true purpose. Dark, graphite marks covered one surface, the unmistakable impression of a rubbing taken from the key's intricate inscription. "Voilà," Poirot breathed, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Our thief sought not possession, but knowledge." In those crucial 10 seconds of darkness, they removed the key, made a careful rubbing of Augustine's inscription, then concealed both key and evidence where no one would think to search, within charity itself. Inspector Japp leaned closer, studying the graphite marks. So they could decipher the inscription at leisure, without the pressure of public scrutiny. Precisely. But observe this detail more closely. Poirot held the paper to the light, revealing the watermark of a distinctive swan within a wreath. Paper of exceptional quality, the sort used for scholarly correspondence. And here, he indicated faint traces on the paper's edge. The warm scent of sandalwood still clings to the wrapping. From deeper within the box, Poirot extracted a second object that made both men draw sharp breaths. A medieval paper knife, its ornate handle bearing traces of something dark on the blade. Not blood, as might be expected, but ink, the same ink used in the graphite rubbing. The weapon was chosen not for its lethality, but for its symbolism, Poirot observed, his voice heavy with understanding. A scholar's tool used to cut through deception and reveal truth, turned instead to violence in service of what the perpetrator believed was a higher truth. But it was the final piece of evidence that completed the psychological portrait. Tucked beneath the donations lay a fragment of parchment, torn from what appeared to be a scholarly edition of Augustine's Confessions. Written in the margin, in the same precise handwriting they had seen on the anonymous notes, was a Latin phrase, caritas ordinata, amor rectus, ordered love, righteous love. The criminal could not resist the compulsion to justify their actions through Augustine's own words, Poirot murmured, carefully replacing each item in its original position. They believed themselves to be protecting sacred knowledge from profane exploitation, using charity itself as both motive and hiding place. As they returned to the drawing room, Poirot's pale eyes swept over the assembled suspects with renewed understanding. Each face revealed its own form of tension. Lady Catherine's aristocratic composure, masking deep concern, Professor Thornfield's academic anxiety, Mr. Pemberton's commercial desperation, Father Morrison's pastoral gravity, James Bellingham's youthful energy constrained by circumstance, and Miss Hartwell's professional competence shadowed by something deeper and more complex. "Mes amis," Poirot announced, his accented English lending formal gravity to the moment. "We have made significant discoveries that illuminate both the method and the psychology of tonight's crimes. The key of charity has been recovered, along with evidence that reveals the true nature of our perpetrator's motivations." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room like morning mist. "But before we proceed to the final revelation, there is one more examination that must be conducted. Inspector Japp will now search each person present, not for the stolen key which we have recovered, but for traces of the materials used in tonight's deception." The systematic search revealed what Poirot had expected. Traces of graphite on certain fingertips, the faint scent of sandalwood clinging to fabric, and most tellingly, small particles of bronze verdigris, the greenish residue that ancient metal leaves upon contact, found in the most unlikely of places. The physical evidence confirms what psychology has already suggested, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of absolute conviction. Our criminal possessed intimate knowledge of the evening's arrangements, legitimate access to the house and its contents, and the scholarly expertise to understand the true significance of Augustine's inscription. Most importantly, they possessed the passionate conviction that the key of charity should not be profaned by public display. The room fell into expectant silence, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but within Bellingham House, the tempest of human passion and deception was finally approaching its resolution. "We shall now adjourn to the library," Poirot announced with theatrical precision, "where Dr. Whitmore lies recovering from his wounds, and where the final truth shall be revealed in the presence of all who have played their parts in this evening's extraordinary drama. There, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that have been both the cause and the stage of tonight's crimes, justice shall at last be served." The psychological game had reached its climax, and Hercule Poirot prepared to unveil the most dangerous criminal of all, one who believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. The library of Bellingham House had been transformed into an impromptu court of justice, its scholarly atmosphere now charged with the electric tension of approaching revelation. Dr. Whitmore, though pale and bandaged, had been carefully positioned in a wing-backed chair near his beloved desk, his eyes alert despite his recent ordeal. The assembled company arranged themselves in a semicircle facing Poirot. who stood with characteristic precision before the great oak shelves that held centuries of accumulated wisdom. The recovered key of charity rested once again in its velvet-lined case, its bronze surface catching the lamplight with an almost accusatory gleam. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter against the tall windows, as if the very heavens were holding their breath for the final revelation. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his accented English lending formal gravity to the moment. "We gather here not merely to solve a crime, but to understand the most dangerous criminal of all, one who commits evil while believing absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. Tonight's events spring not from simple greed or passion, but from love itself, corrupted by possessive devotion." He moved closer to the display case, his pale eyes reflecting the warm glow of the library lamps. "The theft of the key of charity was never intended to be permanent. Our criminals sought not possession, but knowledge, specifically the complete translation of Augustine's inscription, which Dr. Whitmore believed might lead to the discovery of a lost 13th book of the Confessions. The key was removed during those crucial 10 seconds of darkness. A careful rubbing was made of its surface, and then both key and evidence were concealed in the contribution box, where charity itself would hide the crime." Lady Catherine leaned forward, her aristocratic composure barely masking her deep concern. But surely such precise timing required intimate knowledge of the evening's arrangements. "Precisely, madame. Someone who knew exactly when the case would be opened, who understood the symbolic significance of Augustine's teachings, and who had legitimate access to all the security details." Poirot's gaze swept over each face with penetrating intensity. "Let us first eliminate the obvious suspects, for the obvious solution is often merely the most elegant deception." He turned to Mr. Pemberton, whose urbane confidence had long since abandoned him. "Monsieur Pemberton, your financial difficulties and connections to private collectors made you appear guilty. Yet a man who steals for profit does not choose the bronze key when gold and silver offer greater value. Nor does he risk leaving a living witness if his motives are purely commercial." Professor Thornfield shifted uncomfortably as Poirot addressed him next. "Professor, your scholarly dispute and the convenient timing of your mechanical difficulties suggested motive and opportunity, but your honesty in admitting your error about the key's authenticity and the obviously planted evidence of your calling card indicates someone wished us to suspect you rather than genuine guilt on your part. Young Monsieur Bellingham's quick thinking and keen observations have been invaluable to our investigation, but his motives are transparently protective of his aunt. Father Morrison's spiritual concerns are genuine and his methods entirely righteous. And Lady Catherine, though she controls the foundation, has no discernible motive for such desperate action." Poirot paused, allowing the weight of elimination to settle over the room like morning mist. "No, mes amis. Our criminal is someone far more subtle, far more dangerous, someone whose very devotion became the instrument of corruption." From his pocket, he produced the evidence recovered from the contribution box, the rubbing paper with its distinctive watermark, the traces of graphite and bronze verdigris, the fragment of Augustine's text with its marginal notation in precise, scholarly handwriting. The paper bears the watermark of a swan within a wreath. Expensive correspondence paper of the sort used for important scholarly work. The graphite rubbing was executed with expert skill, suggesting someone familiar with manuscript preservation techniques. Most tellingly, the bronze verdigris found beneath certain fingernails indicates direct contact with the ancient metal during those crucial moments. Dr. Whitmore stirred in his chair, his voice weak but audible. "The gesture," he whispered, his hand moving unconsciously to his throat. "Father Morrison saw. The left hand." "Ah, yes," Poirot nodded gravely. Father Morrison observed something that troubled him greatly. During the presentation, when Latin was spoken, he saw the familiar gesture of blessing, but executed with the left hand instead of the right. Dr. Whitmore, a creature of lifelong habit, always makes the sign of the cross with his right hand. In the confusion of those final moments before the lights failed, someone else stood close enough to be mistaken for him in the dim light. Someone who knew his mannerisms, but not the subtle details of his personal piety. The accusation hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Miss Hartwell's composed facade flickered almost imperceptibly, but she remained silent, her leather notebook clutched against her breast like a shield. "Mademoiselle Evelyn Hartwell," Poirot said with infinite gentleness, "your devotion to Dr. Whitmore and his scholarly work is beyond question. For 5 years, you have been his most trusted assistant, the keeper of his research, the guardian of his academic legacy. But devotion, when it becomes possessive, can transform love into its most dangerous opposite." Miss Hartwell's composure finally began to crack, revealing the depths of emotion she had concealed beneath professional competence. Her grip tightened on her notebook as Poirot continued with relentless compassion. "You wrote the anonymous warnings, hoping to prevent tonight's presentation entirely. When those failed, you realized more direct action was necessary. You knew the electrical system was temperamental in damp weather, a detail mentioned by the insurance inspectors during their survey. You positioned yourself close to Dr. Whitmore during the presentation, close enough that in the uncertain light, heights and silhouettes might be confused. When the lights failed, whether by design or fortunate coincidence, you acted with the precision of desperation. You removed the key of charity, made your rubbing with materials from your own scholarly supplies, then concealed both key and evidence in the contribution box. The symbolism was not lost on you, hiding the key within charity itself, the very virtue you believed you were protecting. Miss Hartwell's notebook fell from nerveless fingers, its pages scattering across the Persian carpet like fallen leaves. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of years of suppressed emotion. "You understand nothing of what was at stake," she whispered, her professional mask dissolving entirely. The inscription contained references to Augustine's most private spiritual struggles, his final thoughts on the nature of divine love. Dr. Whitmore was going to publish it all, every sacred word, for the entertainment of newspaper readers and the profit of collectors. He was going to make Augustine's deepest wisdom into a public spectacle. "So you sought to protect what you treasured," Poirot replied with profound understanding. "But Augustine himself warned against such ordered love. Caritas ordinata, when it serves the self rather than the beloved. You believed you were saving Dr. Whitmore's reputation, but you nearly destroyed the very integrity that made him worthy of your devotion." "And the attack upon Dr. Whitmore," Inspector Japp interjected. Miss Hartwell's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "When he followed me toward the library, demanding to know what I had done, I took up the paper knife, meaning only to make him listen, to make him understand. He stumbled in the darkness, struck his head against the desk edge. There was blood, and I thought—" Her voice broke entirely. "I thought I had killed the man I loved most in the world." The confession hung in the library air like a prayer for forgiveness. Dr. Whitmore, despite his weakness, reached out toward his assistant with trembling fingers, his eyes reflecting not anger but profound sadness. "Evelyn," he whispered, "you were always the guardian of my work. But wisdom shared becomes wisdom multiplied, not diminished." Inspector Japp moved forward with the inevitable authority of the law, but Poirot raised a small, perfectly manicured hand. "The crime is solved, mon ami, but the tragedy runs deeper than theft or assault. Here we see love corrupted by its own intensity, devotion transformed into possession, protection become destruction." He turned to Miss Hartwell with infinite compassion. "Mademoiselle, you sought to preserve Augustine's legacy, but you forgot his greatest teaching, that true charity seeks not its own, but gives freely of what it treasures most." As Miss Hartwell was led away, her dignity intact despite her defeat, Poirot remained by the display case, studying the 3 keys that had unlocked so much human folly and revealed so much about the complexities of the heart. "The keys of Saint Augustine," he murmured to the assembled company. "Faith, hope, and charity. Tonight we have seen how even the greatest virtues, when corrupted by human weakness, can become the instruments of their own opposite." "Perhaps, madame," he said to Lady Catherine, "these keys should rest quietly for a time, their lessons absorbed before their wisdom is again displayed." The rain had stopped entirely now, and through the library windows, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the London sky. The psychological game was complete. The human heart laid bare in all its capacity for both nobility and corruption. In seeking to preserve what she treasured most, Miss Hartwell had nearly destroyed it entirely. A tragedy as old as love itself and as enduring as the human condition. Hercule Poirot adjusted his perfect moustache and prepared to depart, leaving behind him the eternal questions that no amount of detection could ever fully answer. Where does devotion end and obsession begin? When does protection become destruction? And how thin is the line between ordered love and its most dangerous corruption? The keys of Saint Augustine had revealed their deepest secret, not hidden in bronze inscriptions or lost manuscripts, but written in the human heart itself, where treasure and corruption dwell side by side, separated only by the choices we make in the darkness of our own souls. The morning light filtering through the library windows cast everything in softer hues as the formal proceedings drew to their inevitable conclusion. Miss Hartwell, her dignity intact despite her circumstances, was led away by Inspector Japp with a gentleness that spoke to the tragedy rather than the criminality of her actions. Her final words to Dr. Whitmore, a whispered apology that carried the weight of 5 years of devoted service, hung in the air like a benediction. "And now, mes amis," Poirot announced, settling himself with characteristic precision before the assembled company, "we must complete our understanding of this most complex affair. For it is not enough merely to identify the criminal. We must comprehend the psychology that transformed devotion into deception, love into its most dangerous opposite." He moved to stand beside the display case, where the 3 keys caught the morning light with renewed brilliance. The clues that revealed Mademoiselle Hartwell's guilt were numerous but subtle. First, the wounded Dr. Whitmore's desperate words. Non il, not he. He was protecting her even in his unconscious state, trying to deflect suspicion from the woman whose misguided love had nearly destroyed him. Lady Catherine leaned forward, her aristocratic composure tempered by genuine curiosity. But surely the physical evidence was equally compelling. "Indeed, madame. The graphite traces upon her fingers, the bronze verdigris beneath her nails, the distinctive watermark of her scholarly correspondence paper, all spoke to her guilt. But most telling was Father Morrison's observation of the left-handed blessing. Dr. Whitmore, a man of lifelong habit, always makes the sign of the cross with his right hand. In those crucial moments before the lights failed, someone else stood close enough to be mistaken for him, someone whose natural gestures betrayed the impersonation. Professor Thornfield, his earlier academic anxiety replaced by somber reflection, spoke quietly. The inscription she sought to protect, was it truly so significant? Dr. Whitmore, though pale and bandaged, managed a weary smile. The key of charity bore Augustine's meditation on ordered love. Caritas ordinata. Evelyn believed it contained references to lost writings that would revolutionize our understanding of the saint's final thoughts. She could not bear the thought of such sacred wisdom being subjected to public scrutiny and commercial exploitation. "Ah, but there lies the tragedy," Poirot observed, his pale eyes reflecting profound understanding. Mademoiselle Hartwell forgot Augustine's fundamental teaching that true charity seeks not to possess, but to share freely. Her love for the saint's wisdom became corrupted by the very possessiveness Augustine warned against. Father Morrison, his weathered hands folded in contemplation, added gravely, "She transformed charity into its opposite, a hoarding of treasure that ultimately destroyed what it sought to preserve." Augustine himself wrote that when we mistake our understanding for divine will, we risk becoming the instruments of corruption rather than preservation. The room fell silent as the full weight of the tragedy settled over them. James Bellingham, his youthful energy subdued by the night's revelations, was the first to speak. What will become of her now? Inspector Japp consulted his notes with professional gravity. She'll face charges of theft and assault, certainly, but given the circumstances, the lack of malicious intent, Dr. Whitmore's recovery, and the obvious psychological distress, the courts may show considerable leniency. Mr. Pemberton, his urbane confidence notably absent, approached Dr. Whitmore with unexpected humility. "I shall return my commission to the Foundation until this matter is properly resolved. There are certain collectors I must discourage from future inquiries." "See that you do," Lady Catherine replied, not unkindly. "We shall suspend the exhibition indefinitely and place the keys in secure custody. Perhaps, as Monsieur Poirot suggested, they require time to rest before their wisdom can be properly shared." Professor Thornfield extended his hand to his colleague with genuine contrition. "Reginald, I propose we publish a joint statement. Careful, measured, acknowledging both the key's significance and the need for scholarly restraint. No sensationalism, no commercial exploitation." Dr. Whitmore grasped the offered hand with surprising strength. "Gladly, Marcus. And Father Morrison, I should like your guidance in presenting the inscription with proper theological context. We owe Augustine and the public that much reverence." As the morning advanced and the household began to stir toward ordinary concerns, Poirot prepared for his departure. At the library door, Dr. Whitmore detained him with a final question. "Monsieur Poirot, do you believe there truly exists a 13th book of the Confessions?" Poirot's eyes grew gentle, reflecting depths of understanding that transcended mere detection. "Non, mon ami. But there is a 13th confession. One written not with ink upon parchment, but with actions guided by charity rightly ordered. That confession is made each time we choose to share wisdom rather than hoard it, to give freely rather than possess jealously." He adjusted his perfect mustache and moved toward the door, pausing for one final observation. "The keys of Saint Augustine have taught us their deepest lesson, mes amis. Faith, hope, and charity remain the greatest virtues, but only when they serve love itself, not our corrupted understanding of what love requires." Outside, London awakened to a world washed clean by the night's storm. As Hercule Poirot stepped into the morning sunlight, he reflected that the human heart, in all its capacity for both nobility and corruption, remained the greatest mystery of all, one that even the most brilliant detective could illuminate but never fully solve. The bronze key had unlocked more than a display case. It had revealed the eternal truth that treasure and corruption dwell side by side in every human soul, separated only by the choices we make when love itself is tested by the darkness of our own desires.